Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Glad to be joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project, on a very big day around here, really.
It's been a big week, obviously the elections, which we'll get to, but we've got a lot of stuff going on. It's been a busy week for Thursday.
A lot of running around, and I should note ahead of time, part of Josh's busy week is that in one of the moments of great timing, I came down with a pretty nasty cold on Monday and have been trying to not be a disease vector and get better as quickly as I can. We're recording here on Thursday, 2 days after the election. I'm still not 100%, so you may detect the occasional cough or sniffle, and we'll edit out what we can, but I can't promise 100% normalcy here. But so thanks, Josh, for all the covering you've done this week with me. It's
been a blur, so it makes it easier.
Yeah, I mean, would have been pretty blurry anyway.
Exactly. I don't know, but I don't even know how it would divide. Yeah, I don't even know how it would be different. This
certainly added some blur to the situation.
Absolutely.
So at any rate, here we are 2 days after the highly anticipated Texas primary elections. And I would start by saying I think this election delivered. Some years there's a lot of run up and then we wind up saying, well, not a lot of surprises here. There's always a little bit of surprise, et cetera, et cetera. But this election was a pretty potent mix of higher voter turnout, a very dynamic electorate in key races, the as usual, a lot of variance in primary polling because primaries are so hard to figure out polling wise, which we'll circle back to. And in some cases, some reasonably surprising results, if not earthquakes. I think. Yeah, do you agree with that? I mean,
I would add to your list too. I mean, there was a ton of money in this primary. I mean, if you think about the millions and millions of dollars spent on both sides, in these primaries is really staggering. When you think about it, that if this weren't Texas, I mean, this could have been the general election spend for a smaller state, right? Just in these primaries, and so I think that's the one thing. I'd also say, to your point, it's like this is one of those. It's funny. I mean, and I think you probably deal with a fair amount of this. In the immediate aftermath, I get a fair amount of my sort of non-political professional friends who want to talk to me about politics, which is, it's okay. I like it sometimes more than others. I love it, everybody. If you're one of those people, please keep talking to me. But it is like, after the election, I got a lot of, kind of what I thought was going to happen. And I'm like, really? This is exactly what you thought was going to happen? Because I follow this pretty closely. And my takeaway is kind of like, man, campaigns matter, which is sort of a weird thing. And I know that that's kind of like a political sciencey thing. But, a lot of times we get to the other side of these races, whether the primaries or generals, it's like, well, that's kind of like what we thought was going to happen. And here, I mean, there's some of that is true, but the specifics of it and the details and how we got there are all really interesting on both sides, and like what's going on at various various levels of the ticket is super interesting. So, I think anyone who's knew, who says that they knew what was going to happen, is like, I'm like, okay, it's fine. I didn't.
Yeah. I mean, I think the overall environment here, the campaigns matter, the how does money matter, how does it not questions are going to be unpackable for a while.
I've been getting a lot of that, which is interesting to me, which is, I had a fair number of reporters sort of, and it's in the context of a larger conversation, but we'll say, so was it just the money? And I'm like, well, I mean, it wasn't just the money, but yeah, I mean, it matters. This is a huge state. Like if you've got $10 million to splash around or $15 million or whatever, and you're trying to mobilize voters in a sophisticated way, yeah, it matters. If you're running ads all over the state in a time in a tiny primary, yeah, it kind of matters because that's what campaigns do and they're well funded. Whereas Normally, a lot of these races or a lot of these candidates are barely even launched in some ways, but they're on the ballot. That's not what we had this time. And so, yeah, all that stuff mattered. And that was kind of what was really interesting, though, in some ways, because we don't usually get that here.
Yeah, there were a lot of themes hovering over or running through these races or running through this primary, and I think what we ought to do is we'll talk about some of the races and some of the outcomes. By the time you listen to this on Thursday, most of you will know this, but we'll do a little bit of summary and a little bit of synthesis along the way. So we'll just start at the top, obviously the Senate race, and let's start with the Democrats. This is a race, both the Republican and the Democrat race, for obvious kinds of reasons that we'll go into, or at least touch on, have gotten a lot of attention. The Democratic race really got a lot of attention because it's been a very dynamic race, and it's been hard to get a handle on. So let's start with that. Now, at press time, with probably the usual 99% of the votes, where there's just a few precincts scattered around out there for whatever reason, and probably some ambiguity in the Dallas area, which we'll talk about, but even that's not playing into this in a big way. James Tallarico came out on top of this race, 52.4%, a little over 1.2 million votes, 1.212. Jasmine Crockett ran second, but with a very respectable 1,068,000 votes at 46.2%. And then Ahmad Hassan with 31,000 votes, a little bit of a factor out there at different points of the evening, though not only early. So a huge national story as well as a state story. James Tallarico started this race, as we've discussed a lot as recently as the last podcast, I think. Started this race with a big rock to push up a hill in some ways, frankly, in terms of the degree to which when he entered this race in the fall, most Texans, including most Democrats, did not know who he was. Right. He was a new name. You mentioned money in this race, raised a lot of money, raised what by all reviews, I think, was a very strong campaign, and overcame that disadvantage in name recognition, which had lingered really through the end of last year, but a very strong campaign in the final couple of weeks, of course, with the Colbert bump, I think we have to say mattered. I mean, you had looked at some Google Analytics data. We can talk about that. But a race that was very dynamic all along and wound up with Tallarico finishing. So there's a lot that we could unpack here. Where do you want to start? I mean, what's your sort of first cut take on this?
Yeah, I think at the highest level, what strikes me about this outcome in the last couple of weeks as you're describing it is how much it really played into the overall discussion about the candidate's strengths and weaknesses, really honestly throughout the campaign. Now, that was an elite discussion, I think, that was really going on out there, although I think it probably at some point started to permeate this question of, in some ways, both of them had an ability to generate attention, as we can see, but there was a concern about whether Crockett could control it sometimes, right? It would be, I think, the way it would put. And what I think that had done in some ways, and I think if you've kind of watched her from the debate through to the election, I think it's fair to say that she ran a pretty conservative primary campaign. It's kind of the primary campaign that you'd expect someone in the front runner status to take in some ways. She doesn't need to go negative against Tallarico. Ultimately, if she can maintain the goodwill that she has, she was in a better position to start this race. And the real concern was that if she went out and did something that really fired up Democrats, she might counter-mobilize, she might go too far, Right. And there are examples of this, right? So I think,
and we should say that by conservative, you mean small c, not ideologically conservative, but campaign tactic conservative. There's a lot of
you're right.
nerves out there. I don't want people to misread that.
No, that's absolutely right, because there are some other elements to that's another piece of this, but we're not there yet. I'd just say, so I think to some extent, one of the things that she was doing that I thought was actually probably to her credit was, just kind of running a pretty traditional campaign, doing the things she needed to do. Tallarico, as you said, sort of having to push this rock up the hill, really went for it in some ways. He leaned into his spending, he leaned into his fundraising, which he'd been putting up good fundraising numbers and used it. He leaned into his ability to generate earned media through a moment. And I mean, and I say that because, again, like to say, hey, this is the interview Donald Trump doesn't want you to see, and then posting that everywhere, like that was a decision that was meant to, drive interest, drive eyeballs. But it's also like he was on Joe Rogan before that. He was on The View before that. He had done these things. So in some ways, the things that like had made him a strong candidate, like his strengths and her perceived, whether real or whatever weaknesses that led her to be a little bit more conservative, just sort of created a vacuum that allowed him to kind of sweep the field. I'm not saying that she done something different or spent more money or gone out and kind of like fired it up with a bunch of, rallies, jumping on tables or whatever. I'm not saying that she would have filled that space and he wouldn't have had this momentum, that word I'm thinking about right now. But in some ways, by sort of sitting there as a front runner, she allowed him to kind of fill that space, and then he really did it and caught lightning in a bottle, I think, in a lot of ways with Colbert. That's my first overall kind of like takeaways. I look at the race like to this point. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think, a lot of this has already been kind of discussed to death, and I'm kind of loath to be too repetitive of what's already out there. I mean, I guess what I'm interested in, or what is interesting to me as of now that it's over, is the degree to which this race contrasts with the other race. And we talked about this a little bit. I'm beginning to forget where I talked about what, frankly.
I'm glad you're bringing this up because I think this is a
but
huge
this
part
notion
of
of how Tallarico and Crockett started out, or that this race unfolded along the lines that we've talked about, with Crockett with a significant advantage at the beginning and name recognition and favorability among Democrats, not only well known but well liked.
Yeah.
And I think that's
important.
really important to point out. Tallarico had this situation where he had to not only spread his name recognition, he had to spread his name recognition as he was working on also persuading voters to prefer him over Crockett. But overall, neither of these candidates had significant negatives among Democrats and among the voters that they were trying to woo. And that was very different from the Republican race.
Right.
So let's talk about the Republican race a little bit, and then we'll kind of tie them together. So in the Republican, why don't you give us the 411 on,
Yeah, sure.
Nobody knows what that means anymore. Give us the overview of the Cornyn Paxton Hunt race.
That's right. So overall, maybe surprisingly, the incumbent John Cornyn ended up getting the plurality of the vote, 41.9%, about 900,000 votes, 907,000. Attorney General Ken Paxton came in second by about a point, 40.7, so 1.2 point difference as of 99% of the precincts reporting. So let's just say it's about a 1 percentage point difference, about 881,000 votes. So we're talking about 20 or 800.
Well, Paxton had 881,000.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, 881,000 votes. So that's at a 26,000 vote difference. It's a pretty narrow margin.
Very.
Now, Wesley Hunt ended up with 13.5%, 292,000 votes. And the final candidate ended up with 1.2% of the vote, another 26,000, which I guess, had she not been in the race, it would have been interesting to see where the 26,000 votes went. First thing, I mean, just real quick to just dispense with Wesley Hunt for just a moment, not forever, but just for right now in this discussion, which is, he was polling very high, or pretty high, I would say, for a lot. And he was actually, the race, and was actually increasing his vote share in the polling. But this is like a tendency we see a lot around third candidates and even like third party candidates and like that, where people in polling are very willing to express support for these candidates. But when push comes to shove and they get in the election booth and they know the race is really between two other people, some share of those voters are going to go and pick in, between the two people that we're actually going to be picking between. And that's what we saw here. So this I think the difference there is pretty normal to the pattern. Anyway, to your point overall, and I'll just to link to what you were saying before about the Democratic side, whereas voters on the Democratic Party express overwhelmingly positive views towards both of these candidates, like in no way would you say this was a repudiation of Jasmine Crockett. She got over 1 million votes here. it's not as though the Tallarico voters expressed negative views of her. That is not the case on the Republican side.
Right.
Right. And I would say, if anything, when we were looking, into the data that we had and looking around even at other people's data, it's really remarkable the extent to which the Republican primary electorate overall is pretty ambivalent about these candidates. So what I mean when I say ambivalent is there are voters who have positive views, there are voters who have negative views, but they're large groups of each, in some cases. They're kind of almost even in many cases when we looked in the Republican primary electorate. And so what that meant is it's just a different kind of race, whereas Democrats in a lot of cases were almost flipping a coin, deciding whether they liked Tallarico more than Crockett at the last minute, or whether they want to stick with the person they knew or whatever they were deciding. For a Republican who maybe was deciding they were supporting Ken Paxton, there's a very good chance they do not like John Cornyn. And for those,
I think the sort of median tendency in the fave-unfaves among the overall Republican electorate in our polling has consistently been hovering right around 1 in 5.
Yeah.
Little below or little above 20%. And clearly, importantly, not the same 20% necessarily, had unfavorable views of Cornyn and of Paxton.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just so different. And it, as I was saying, going into the race, in many ways, the consistency and the knowledge of that pattern, in part, was part of the rationale for the Wesley Hunt candidacy, and in part why you're seeing him with almost 300,000 votes. Even if the numbers, he underperformed his polling numbers a little bit, while the other two overperformed generally their polling numbers, and it's just it's a big difference, and it's a big difference that looms as we go not just into the runoff, though it's going to loom very large there. We'll come back to the runoff in a sec, I think. But it also looms large in the positioning of the two general election candidates, whoever comes out of the runoff, as we think about what this race is going to look like in the summer going into the fall. It poses a question mark for Republicans. And I want to be careful not to overplay that.
Yeah. No, for sure.
But I think when you start a runoff campaign knowing that these negatives are there, and knowing that runoff race is going to be high visibility and very negative, it really does set Tallarico up to recharge a little, work on healing whatever things do have to be negotiated in the aftermath of this primary. And there are some lingering issues. I think they're not as big as the Cornyn-Paxton issues, but they are pre-existing Democratic coalition management issues, particularly around race. There isn't a debrief of this race that I've seen that doesn't, and I think rightly so, talk about what seem to be the patterns in racial voting in that race. And I think it's pretty good for the Democrats. Not decisive, but handy for Tallarico to have some time to work on some of those issues in the interim, while we're seeing what is going to be, pick your violent metaphor, a battle royale, a knife fight, a bloodbath, yada, yada, yada.
It's the purge
on the Republican side.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the thing that I'm thinking about is, you're mentioning, it's like, look, the sky is not falling for Republicans here, and whoever emerges from that primary is still going to, likely be the favorite to win that Senate seat, I think. And I think, to your point here, you can look at this, you can say, hey, about 1 million voters, Republican primary voters voted for Cornyn, about 1 million Republican primary voters voted for Paxton. There's a good sense that a good share of each of those doesn't like the other. And the issue is not so much that they're not going to go vote for Democrats. Let's just stop right there, right? They're Republican primary voters, and they're probably going to show up, but they're probably going to vote for Republican candidates. The challenge is, but what if they all don't, right? What if a quarter of Paxton's voters, should Cornyn go on, decide, I'm not for this. I'm not supporting this guy. I buy everything that I've seen, and likewise. The reality is that really chips away at the Republican advantage that we've seen in closer elections here. And to say it's going to be the factor, no. Would it be one factor in making the race more competitive than we might expect? Sure, absolutely. And as you point out, in some ways, there's a lot of factors that are pushing that direction. So we can't say it's like one thing or anything, but this is just another piece of evidence in the list of why Republicans should expect a competitive race here.
Right. And if we, I think if you step back and think about the big dominant metaphor of the upcoming general election, which will just get on the table now, is there's the issue of this is what we saw in this election, particularly the big surge in Democratic turnout, comports with the general understanding that this is going to be a good national Democratic year.
Right.
So it really does raise the question of the Republican state level advantage firewall against that in Texas, and how the nature of this race affects, the effectiveness of that firewall vis-a-vis this wave.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something about the wave firewall thing that I don't really like, or seawall thing. I should say wave seawall, not firewall.
Yeah.
So I think that is pretty big. And I would just add to, because of that, I guess where I was going with that is that if you do have some attrition due to the outcome of the Republican race, whether it's Paxton or Cornyn, and bitterness and a lack of enthusiasm among each, it doesn't even have to be a quarter of the Paxton or Cornyn supporters. It could be a couple of percent.
Yeah.
Right. And, at this point, 2 or 3%, or even 1 to 3% lack of enthusiasm among your baseline Republican turnout is going to translate into something that matters, that could really matter at the general election.
Right. That's right.
So that's the problem. It doesn't have to be a lot.
Exactly. And this is what we talked about. This is the challenge of mobilization politics, which is so dominant and sort of all American campaigns now, is that if the way that you win is by mobilizing your voters, anything that demobilizes any subset of your voters is a problem by definition. Right. And that's kind of that's the thing. These things are adding up a little bit, and that's the concern, I think.
Yeah. So let's take a look at the rest of the ballot, and we'll circle back to some of these bigger themes that we've touched on early on now.
Can I ask you one more question on the Senate race? I mean, just
yeah, sure.
Because I have an answer to this, but I want to ask you instead, which is like, so John Cornyn, is he in the strongest position now that he's been in this race?
Yeah,
straight up, right? I mean,
I think. Look, I think if you talk to the Cornyn people, what they have been saying all along, and now this works to their advantage, is that they are stronger than everybody thought, and that all the polls are bullshit, quote unquote. That's an indirect quote, and watch us go. Yeah. Now, they are vindicated by this, but that said, that's because expectations were so low in part.
And I think that's right.
I mean, as you said in the number advantage, it's not like Cornyn wiped the floor with Paxton. He bested him by some tens of thousands of votes, but out of a couple million votes, we're not talking about a big margin. Nonetheless, the symbolic value, obviously, of being able to say that Cornyn finished first is very important. And we're seeing that play out right now with the speculation, fed, of course, by the president himself, that Trump has said he's going to endorse because he has to, and it's important. The general idea out there in the ether does seem to be that, for various kinds of reasons, but his nominal first place finish being important among them, is that Trump is going to endorse Cornyn. Now, that this could be confirmed or proven to be yet another bad ether assumption by the time we get this podcast published later Thursday. But that's how it looks right now, and it does matter that first place finish can be called a first place finish, and again, legitimately, and that it does underline it's a good moment for John Cornyn. I mean, I think it's to answer your question briefly, or less long. I think you'd be hard pressed if we were to go and content analyze the characterization of John Cornyn in news coverage. Right. This would be a pretty big spike in the positive direction among otherwise negative to faint praise treatment of him.
The one quick reaction I had to what you say in terms of, the Cornyn campaign's been saying these things all along. The one thing I do agree with in terms of that characterization of what they would say is that he has been stronger all along. And I mean, I think we said this before, there's been a certain amount of ingestion and incorporation of this of his weakness, and we're part of that. I mean, because we're looking at the data, we've been saying it, so I don't want to say we're not feeding that narrative in some ways. But the other side that we've also been saying, and yet he goes out, he wins primaries, he goes into the general election, he tends to lead the Republican ticket in terms of vote getting. Obviously, he knows what he's doing, and obviously, that's the other thing. Most of these Republican primary voters, even most of the Republican primary voters in this particular primary, have probably cast a ballot for John Cornyn at some point in their lives if they voted in an election.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's just something you got to remember here. This isn't like even people who maybe say like, hell, I think John Cornyn could be more committed or whatever. They're still weighing the fact that they have voted for him a bunch of times. He is in the leadership. He has been a fixture of state politics. And I think, that is true. The weakness that people have associated with him, it can be overblown at times. And to some degree, it's like a desire for some kind of a self-fulfilling thing too.
Yeah. And unless we should not neglect the fact that many millions have been spent in negative advertising against Ken Paxton.
Yeah, which we all knew was going to happen all along, and I think that's been the question all along: is that effect going to work? And this is something that we've been talking about, from the polling perspective for so long, is that people haven't been paying attention to this race for a very long time. Again, we have the insiders have, obviously, but most normal people who are voting this primary were not paying a ton of attention, and once they were, John Cornyn was spending, and his allies, to be clear, were spending a ton of money to try to bury Ken Paxton.
And we should note that that's not to say that this is over.
Yeah, no,
by any means. So
yeah.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the rest of the ballots. So there shall be runoffs.
Yes.
In addition to this, the most prominent runoff that we're talking about in the Senate race. Runoffs for Attorney General in both parties. Mm-hmm. Runoff on the Republican side in a railroad commissioner race that didn't get a lot of public interest, but because the railroad commission is, of course, of critical importance in Texas, and there are colorful figures in that race, particularly Beau French. So there'll be a runoff in that race on the Republican side, on the lieutenant governor's race on the Democratic side, and then a handful of congressional races that we'll touch on, right?
Yeah.
Are there anything big out there?
In terms of the top of the ticket we're thinking about? There's also there's going to be some runoffs in the legislature as well, but not a lot. Yeah, I guess before we jump down ballot a little bit more, one of the other sort of interesting kind of takeaway 30,000-foot observations from the night was sort of the unevenness of Abbott and the leadership's involvement in some of these down ballot statewide races, right? So Sid Miller was removed from the Republican ticket by Nate Sheets, who was endorsed by Abbott. I think basically pushed past. That was a close race too. It was 52-40, 52.7, 47.3. So they just barely knocked him out. But on the flip side, Kelly Hancock, former state senator, current comptroller as appointed and promoted by Abbott and sort of state leadership, pasted by Don Huffines, who got 57.4% of the vote to his 23.6. So pretty uneven there. And also just in overall, I don't know what your reaction, if hot take is to all that, but really interesting kind of going forward and thinking about state leadership and the team and what it looks like, thinking about it, assuming these guys make it into office in November.
Yeah, there's a lot embedded there.
Yes,
on that point about the team, it intersects what Republican leadership team might emerge in the general election with all the necessary caveats when the election hasn't happened, et cetera, et cetera. But
right.
It does sort of get to a piece that I was going to touch on later. There are two questions there at least. One is this, or extension questions there about the impact of endorsements and the Trump versus Abbott endorsement.
Yeah.
Thing, which itself triggers a lot of complicated questions. And then the other piece that I think is probably a little more directly related to the question you're asking me about the unity of the leadership team, et cetera, should the election result in Republican-dominated government again? And the theme I'm talking about is incumbents and how much incumbents suffered. I mean, there was a little bit of there's an article in the New York Times today that I thought was well reported, but poorly framed in terms of looking both at North Carolina and Texas. And it was focused mostly on North Carolina, but they dragged Texas into it in terms of saying, oh, it was a tough election for incumbents. And I think that's actually wrong. Comparatively, or at least if they were going to frame it that way, I would have liked to have seen the inclusion of more trend data. Well, the thing we always raise, well, it's up here for incumbents compared to what?
Right,
In Texas,
yeah.
certainly not compared to the last cycle.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But in this case, I mean, that question helps me back into a response to your direct question, which is the Sid Miller and Kelly Hancock races both were pretty singular circumstances, I think.
Yeah.
There were some things that were very particular to those races.
Yeah.
Governor Abbott getting involved has a lot to do with Sid Miller being a thorn in the governor's side for quite some time now.
Yeah.
Probably going back at least to COVID.
Yeah.
Kelly
also a
Hancock's
liability.
loss in the controller's race. Also, there were some real dynamics in that race. I mean, considering Kelly Hancock, the incumbent in that race, is at best a technical classification. It's not wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
But he had never run statewide before. He was appointed to that office and not appointed with a great deal of fanfare, I would say.
Yeah.
As a way I would put that, and Hancock's position with with others in the Republican leadership, particularly Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and other elements of the base. I mean, I just think there were a lot going on in those races,
Yeah.
and what that portends then as an answer to your question once everybody arrives, I think is kind of up in the air. I mean, look. It's no secret that there's no love lost between Governor Abbott and Don Huffines after Huffines challenged him in 2022 and emerged as a trenchant critic of the governor during the COVID response period. So does it mean there's going to be almost certainly friction between Governor Abbott and Don Huffines? Should they both be in office in the fall? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, one point,
period.
yeah. And I mean, one point that someone made to me, and I think this is just sort of interesting to keep in mind or remember, is that, Don Huffines is basically able to self-fund his campaigns. And
Yes.
in some ways, one of the things and you say, well, yeah, sure, that's important. But the reason it's particularly important here is that one of the things that Abbott has over the Republican universe is his massive fundraising machine. And honestly, that does not matter to Don Huffines.
Right.
And that sort of puts him in a little bit of a different space compared to a lot of these other candidates and potential governing partners.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think that's an important element of this.
Let's say that
Things
story
that were particular to these races.
I was saying to someone else the other day, that story's not ripe yet, but worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and it's gonna ripen.
Yeah, that's right.
Should that be the situation, it will be very ripe. Right. And certainly by the time we get to the next session.
So let's talk about some of the other races.
Okay. Well, let's look at Congress.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting races out there. And I think we'll probably come back to them. I think, the runoffs in the AG races in both parties is going to be pretty active and interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Even though in the run-up, those races had received very little attention from the general public. And I haven't looked at the final numbers. It was pretty decent amount of ballot roll-off. I don't want to do the New York Times thing and not compare it to trends. But there was some ballot roll-off going down to looking at those races in the primaries, which also made them difficult to get a handle on going in. So not surprised, and the multiple candidates, not surprising we're seeing runoffs. Now, some of these congressional races were pretty interesting and have gotten a lot of national attention. We don't have a lot of time to go into all of them, but we do want to flag. I mean, I flagged them. Do you agree? I mean, I think the one getting the most national attention, and I think deservedly so, is the Republican primary in Texas too, where Dan Crenshaw lost to Steve Toth. Part of that is the
Steve Toth?
knowledge of those candidates
Yeah,
locally.
both of them,
I mean,
honestly, yeah.
Crenshaw, has been in Austin a lot and well known, and was kind of a wunderkid in his early
Yeah,
rise.
he was a
but-
darling for a little
yeah,
bit.
but
I mean,
got crosswise, wound up on the wrong end of the Trump thing. The only non-Trump endorsed Republican congressional
yeah.
incumbent, I think, in this race.
I'm going to we're doing big picture takeaways and observations. And you just mentioned, the AG races. And I can't help but think of Crenshaw in the same lane in some way as Chip Roy, not because they're the same ideologically or anything else, but because they've distinguished their own brands within the Republican Party. And in some ways, both of them leaned into being, in some ways their own entities. And, there's been a question, especially in the AG race, as, State Senator Mays Milton really leaned into MAGA Mays Milton were all the ads, right? And Chip Roy basically said, well, I can't walk away, from the points of division that I made for myself. So I'm going to lean into them and say that's a strength. I'm an independent guy. Like, that's what you want in the AG's office. And all indications are that probably is not working out for him. And then you look over here at Dan Crenshaw and it's like, oh, okay, maybe not working out for you either. I mean, it doesn't seem like I take those two races and my overall takeaway is there's not a lot of room in the Republican Party, at least right now, in this moment in time. I'm not saying that there can't be some opening up as we move towards the general, but there's not a lot of room in the Republican primary right now to create your own unique brand.
Yeah, I mean, and I think particularly if that unique brand is perceived as
right,
too distinct and too inconsistent with support for Donald Trump. I mean,
right.
And we'll come back to the end if we have time on weighing where Trump's status. But these two are those. That's a really good comparison to make. Chip Roy not being as successful as many expected in the AG race, or some expect, certainly as successful as Chip Roy expected.
Yeah.
But I guess I would also, I can't help but also contrast that the Crenshaw-Roy strategy of distinguishing themselves from Trump, particularly after his loss in 2020, with other members of the delegation, which is virtually all of the other Republican members of the delegation, that have generally just gone all in with Donald Trump, no matter what.
Right.
And we're not really talking about any of them having trouble for having done that.
Right. Yeah.
Right, so we've also got the runoff in CD9, like this the rise of Steve Toth in Texas too. In CD9, you've got the Mealer-Briscoe-Kane runoff with Briscoe-Kane finishing second in that race, as I recall. Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things.
By about 4.5 points.
Probably more interesting to us as close observers of Texas politics to see whither goes Briscoe-Kane than anything else. But it's interesting, and obviously Briscoe-Kane, interestingly, was really, I think, pretty. I remember Briscoe-Kane flying to. Speaking of 2020, Briscoe-Kane was flying to D.C. He sent the picture up on Twitter to go and fight the fight, on stopping the election count and stuff. And it's like, and here we are now, and it's like, you may not be elected. We'll see.
The payoff on that was probably not what he might have hoped.
No.
And then another interesting Republican result in HD 34, and that'll transition us into another discussion here. Eric Flores wins cleanly over Mayra Flores to face Vicente Gonzalez in the HD 34, which has been a focus of a lot of Republican interest. Mayra Flores had that seat briefly, having defeated Gonzalez. He came back and beat her. Flores had been supported twice by national Republicans, including Trump. This time they abandoned ship and backed Eric Flores, same last name, no relation. So interesting for people that have been tracking that race into the overall discussion of Republicans in South Texas and the success of the 2025 redistricting. This is one of the districts that Republicans had hoped to flip again after Flores's brief success with it. That seems to be looking less likely in most analysis. Gonzalez didn't have any trouble in his primary. And so that race is out there in Congress, but also one where interesting Republican politics at play. And then on the Democratic side, you're going to have a runoff in HD 18, this also linked to the redistricting. This is where Al Green is who moved out of the district that he was essentially redistricted out of into challenging Christian Menifee, a brand new incumbent. Menifee edges Green out 46 to 44.2%. Not very many votes, less than 2,000 vote margin there.
Yeah.
So that'll be, and that is a race that is being billed as, part of the generational discussion in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, that'll just be interesting to watch and see what happens. I don't think I have anything, particularly enlightening to say about that. I mean, we talked about how the fact that, Al Green's sort of constant presence. And if you're if you're listening to this outside of Texas, Al Green, we get press releases from Al Green's people all the time. And then you get off the list and you're back on. He promotes what he's doing and the way that he does it all the time. So I think his name ID there is pretty high. Having said that, it's going to be an interesting race. And I think the generational thing is very interesting there too.
Yeah, he's a big personality.
He's a big personality.
Kicked out of the Trump speeches before Congress, the State of the Union and Trump's pseudo State of the Union first term, I think, been kicked out a couple times for being vocal in his response to Trump. Again, helpful, but clearly in this case, not determinative.
Right.
And then another redistricting forced more or less face-off between Colin Allred and incumbent Julie Johnson in HD 33. Allred inserted himself apparently to good effect, I don't know, for him, in the Senate primaries we've talked about on the podcast. He finishes about 7,500 or so votes ahead of Julie Johnson, so that's 44% for Allred, 33.2 for Julie Johnson. A couple of other candidates in that race that pulled in about 22, 23 points, making it very difficult for this race to avoid a runoff. And I think that's going to be interesting too in that area of the state.
Yeah, I think, it's funny because, you start talking about the redistricting thing, you get back and you say, okay, we did all that. It was like Royal this summer, and it's like, okay, so Al Green's against Menifee, so one of those guys is gonna go. Allred's against Johnson, so one of them is gonna be the casualty of this. And, and then you're kind of looking down in South Texas and you're like, man, if you're looking at the trends in Hispanic attitudes, that's not looking as competitive as it maybe once was. And you're like, boy, this seemed to be like a lot to get two heads basally, potentially.
But it does the work they're wanting.
It does the
to
work,
do.
yeah.
It looks particularly like in that North Texas race where you've got Colin Allred, African American, who ran in 2022 unsuccessfully, or 2024 unsuccessfully for the Senate, and very much weighed in, I would say, on the left moderate side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Julie Johnson, much more known as a progressive, from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. In some ways, the Republicans are getting what they want there.
Yeah, that is right.
How big a beer it is, we'll see, but it will be interesting to watch that. All right, in the Texas legislature, we're going to go in these in a lot of detail, but just in many ways, for the most part, I would say a reasonably quiet set of legislative elections. Not a lot of incumbent losses. Cecil Bell, Stan Kitzman on the Republican side go down as incumbents. Both of them were on the endangered lists. And then Chris Turner, in a kind of generational turn, loses in his primary. When I looked, Turner was in kind of the yellow zone of a few of these lists.
Yeah.
People had realized, I think, honestly, it had been a little under my radar.
Yeah.
But, Chris Turner, longtime fixture in the legislature, head of the Democratic caucus for a while. So that raised a few eyebrows, but also does another data point in this kind of generational discussion, stimulated very strongly by Tallarico, but also, for that matter, Jasmine Crockett, and the nature and the youth on display in the Senate race, and this issue coming up in some other places in the Democratic Party in the state. But I think probably more notable here is the number of perceived under threat candidates who did survive.
Yeah.
Mostly, almost exclusively, we're talking of the attention being paid on the Republican side. Republicans do, run the legislature. So understandably, top of that list, Burroughs Committee Chair Ken King survives without a runoff even. And, some of the other names here, Angela Ord, Andy Hopper, David Cook, Angie Chen Button, and Chairman Leach, and Trent Ashby, who's moving up into the Senate in Texas Senate 3, glides pretty easily into the nomination on the Republican side in what is a very Republican Senate district. So you step back, I think the overall narrative here is relatively quiet, particularly compared to all the vicious infighting that we saw last time.
Yeah, I think that seems pretty reasonable.
And I think we can, flag the Texas, TLR, rise of the Republican trial lawyer, interest group piece of this, and that some of the challenges that were going to be made to the people that had been targeted by Texans for lawsuit reform kind of fizzled when TLR pulled out of those races. And they've, I'll let them defend where they were successfully, et cetera. I'm sure we'll come back to this later on. And I think for time's sake, we'll kind of put that there. So making sense of it all as we head into the next phase. What do you want to hit here? We've hit a couple of the things. I mean, I hit this notion of the incumbent trope that was out there, and that's a little bit of a minor point, but I think was worth mentioning. What do you want to say something about this Trump Abbott thing, Josh?
Let's see.
Endorsements that we haven't already said.
Well, I think that, I think you mentioned something. I guess let's say this, something that I'm keeping out. I don't know if you mentioned this. I think I'm stealing part of this from you, so I want to be clear. And if you said this, take it over. But there is some sense, you're kind of wondering, what is the half-life of sort of MAGA and the Trump influence on some of this stuff. There's cracks in the polling data. I think I mentioned it last week. I think, and some of that is, it's small, but as we've talked about earlier in the podcast, it doesn't need to be a lot, for the cracks in the coalition to be problematic. And so I think, one of the things that I am kind of wondering about here as we go forward is, Trump is sort of in some ways, if not necessarily exiting the scene, he's certainly complicating the situation, right? Because governing's complicated and his approach to it is very complicated. But as, we kind of continue down the end of this, through the midterm and through the end of his term, it is a question about how much control he can wage over the Republican Party, which right now is still significant. But also, what if he can, and what does that look like? I mean, it's a totally wild question to imagine right now. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that, Abbott remains strong. I mean, in all of this, one of the things that nobody has talked about at any point in time is, any sort of real serious primary challenge to Abbott. He's got the money. His numbers are kind of sitting where they're sitting, a little bit better than most of the other people in terms of statewide Republican leadership.
Yep.
And, as much as we've talked about, how Abbott's a sophisticated, campaigner who knows what he's doing, Cornyn, that is, how Cornyn is a sophisticated campaigner who knows what he's doing. He's done it a lot of times. It's really something that I think people don't appreciate is not only does Abbott have a ton of resources, but he spends a ton of resources on figuring out how to spend his resources more effectively.
Yeah.
He does a lot of research. He has a lot going on in the state. And so, endorsements aside, I don't know if it really matters. I think Abbott can in some ways exert so much influence over the party and over the process here because he has just so much sway over kind of the state discussion, both as his role as governor, but also with all the resources that he commands, Yeah. And I don't think that changes.
He's a huge presence in what we can dorkily call the political economy of these elections.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned you kind of jump past the sort of, taking it all, going ahead, kind of looking at it. I say, look, this is yet another data point that I add kind of into the, it was a good night for Democrats, right? I mean, we kind of get around all this other stuff. And then I know that there's sort of this like touchiness about the Crockett, Tallarico race and everything else. But the fact that it's not a runoff, there's a clear answer. The governor, there's a gubernatorial candidate is set for the Democrats, even though Vicki Goodwin is going to need to run through the runoff to get the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor. There's a good chance she's going to do that, in a way that's going to introduce herself to more Democrats and really
could turn out to be a benefit.
Yeah, and the thing is, the Republicans at this point normally are sitting there saying, "Okay, we've got everything set. Let's just start, defining the most dangerous Democrat in front of us." And right now, they're kind of actually got to focus their voters on something else, right? I mean, there's something else going on right now that's going to be grabbing their attention, and that's not good for them either. None of that is determinative, and this is sort of the thing that I've been trying to make clear for people in some ways of cause or consequence. The most important thing in terms of this election cycle, in terms of the overall dynamics, is that there's a complete Republican control. So that the incumbent party is the Republican Party. If attitudes towards the economy seem negative, which honestly, they're looking like they're getting a little bit better, but now if we assume oil prices are going up going into summer, that might be a real hard thing to deal with if prices go up on top of, what is already perceived as high prices. And those things are putting wind in the Democratic sails. To the extent that, the Democrats go and win a special election in the state Senate district, that's an example of the wind that's in their sails. To the extent that their turnout is really high in this election, that's an example of the wind that's in their sails. It's not the evidence in and of itself. It's not the cause. Democrats got so many people turn out in this primary, so therefore, no. It's all the same stuff pushing this direction. We're kind of seeing that take place. And so I think, when you add to that, and yet again, Democrats seem pretty unified behind these candidates. You'd mentioned, or we talked about at the top, that it's not as though Democrats who voted for Crockett don't like Tallarico. And it's not as though that the Democrats who voted for Tallarico rejected Crockett. So they're moving ahead in this relatively unscathed at the top of the ticket, which again just adds to sort of their general feeling of hopefulness for their party.
Well, and I think part of that, there's a lot. I think there's some more to be said about that. I want to go back to the Trump Abbott thing and add just a little bit to that.
Sure,
I mean, I think when I raised this with you, maybe the morning after the election, I think as we were having our early morning debrief call, what I'm interested in here, and as I've gone through and prepped for this and prepped for some other stuff I'm doing, the Trump question is so interesting because it's a long-term question, and that's kind of the way I broached it when we first, and I was kind of saying, hey, this is half-baked, and it's still pretty half-baked, but going through this, on one hand, I'm struck by the implications and what we should read into the dynamic around Crenshaw and Roy as the lingering. I mean, I don't want to be taken as saying, oh, the Trump thing is over, because I don't think that at all. No. And it still looms very large. But there is something that makes, I guess what I'm noticing here is that this midterm is going to be, in all likelihood, the plateau or the first clear sign of decline, even if it's minor, in Trump's stature and influence. Yeah. And part of that is inevitable. Yeah. Even Donald Trump, who is Donald Trump, and whether you hate him or love him, has, striding like a colossus across the political system of the United States. We've talked about the data and the flattening of his numbers or even decline and all that. But I think there's a good reason that you kind of edged into this discussion of the environment and the environment that Trump owns, and that by extension now, because of Trump's lingering influence, Republicans in Texas have to own too. And that's going to be the impact of this adventure in Iraq or in Iran. Whoops. Freudian slip.
Yeah, right.
And its impact as an economic policy.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that, we've been like broken records in here for the last year and a half, 2 years, going back to the election that Joe Biden lost, or that Kamala Harris lost, and Joe Biden had to drop off of, about the persistent science of economics here and people's view of the economy, and primarily and especially their sensitivity to prices and costs of living. And that is weighing heavily on Trump. And I think it did not make manifest here, but the fact that he is going to jump into this Senate race is going to be a big roll of the dice. Yeah. Yeah. If he follows through on that and they do what they're going to do, even if he endorses is the expectation, and we can play this out, even if he endorses Cornyn, and even if Cornyn then wins, this is going to cost him some political capital.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a discussion in another panel thing I did for the New York Times a couple weeks ago, in which I kind of went off and was kind of feeling this out in real time at the time. But I mean, there are a lot of people that are going to see, if Trump endorses Cornyn, there are a lot of Republicans in Texas who are going to have a real problem with that.
Yeah.
They may even vote for Cornyn in the general election, but it is going to be at odds with their sense of Donald Trump and their sense of who they should be with. So now with that, anything else you want to hit on?
Anything else you want me to hit on? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you want to talk about the trajectory of polling in the Senate race a little bit? I think we probably should. I mean, it's going to seem like we're not talking about it if we don't.
No, let's talk about it. I mean, look, I think one of the tropes that was kind of going on in this election cycle was sort of this, what's going on with the polling in Texas? It's all over the place. And it's interesting because if you just kind of lay it out, and when I say lay it out, I mean lay it out based on the field dates in which the polling was conducted. What it looks like is prior to about the middle of February, which we'll come back to in a second, it looked as though Jasmine Crockett was maintaining a high single to low double-digit lead in most of the polling that was available, most of the publicly available polling that you could dig into and look at some of the crosstabs and get a sense of what was going on, right? Around the middle of February, and I'll point out that the Tallarico interview with Stephen Colbert posted on February 16th. And after that, Tallarico consistently in the polling is leading by about high single digits to low double digits. I looked at the samples of all these polls, and they're pretty consistent in terms of the compositions that they purport the Democratic electorate to look like. And so, overall, it's a pretty consistent story, which was, and it tells a story that honestly is confirmed in a lot of ways by the polling that we've been looking at for the better part of the last year, which is that Crockett entered the race more well-known, universally liked among Democrats. That seemed to translate into a relatively comfortable, though not significantly overwhelming lead. As we talked about, she took a relatively quiet approach to the final weeks of the campaign, whereas Tallarico, in addition to spending about $15 million to her $5 based on the most recent estimates I could find, so 3-1, then also happened to create a social media moment that was seen by, at this point, probably almost 10 million people. Again, in a race where both candidates got about 1 million votes. So just to say, the scope of that, who knows? Now, whether that's direct and people watch it and making up their mind about Tallarico, or whether that person's in California and writes a check. Ultimately, it all benefited to him pretty clearly. And if you go and you look at the Google Analytics and see what were people searching and when were they searching for Crockett's name, when were they searching for Tallarico, you look over any time period, and there's this massive, massive spike in Tallarico searches.
It just breaks the top of the graph.
It breaks everything, and it's February 17th, the day after that video posts. Interestingly, searches for Crockett go up too, but but all the searches for Crockett are in the context of Tallarico.
Yeah.
They're all in the context of basically, what he just did. And so, I understand the criticisms are that, in some ways, the constant criticism around primary polling, which is, you're not accurately predicting the views of this group, this tiny population that doesn't exist yet. And we say, yeah, it's tough, not to mention the increase in turnout, all these other things that made this an even less, transparent electorate to us before it appeared, which it's never transparent. But when you add in, big increase in turnout, we had more early voters by we had about a 50% increase in the number of voters who cast their ballot early compared to the entirety of those Democratic primary voters who cast ballots in 2024 or 2022. So this is just a different kind of election. Nonetheless, the polling said Crockett seems to be advantaged. He seems to be in the lead. Once Tallarico started spending that money and then caught lightning in a bottle, all of a sudden, a lot of the voters who came in late probably, and a lot of those undecided voters probably broke his way. And I think that's the story that the polling tells. And I'm not saying it's the story that any poll tells, because each poll is, I hate the cliche, a snapshot in time. But when you line up all these snapshots one after the other, it seems like what I was watching.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting variation on the thing that we always talk about and that people do this kind of work always talk about, which is, all things being equal, we would like to have more polling data.
Yeah. We
often think about that as allowing us to compare estimates within a kind of time window. Mm-hmm. But a big part of the story this time, as you say, and I think is really important, is how things changed over time. And you could see going into this, and we've been saying that, I think, that was going to be a factor, that Tallarico was going to have to introduce himself. He was going to have the money to do that. Of course, it's hard to predict an event like the Colbert thing. So,
Yeah. And then,
and again, I think we were both reluctant to say, well, we can overestimate, who knows where those people were watching. But I mean, I think the scale of that as an event, as an intervention, was pretty significant and kind of hard to underplay.
Yeah. I think there's a really, there's a contrast here in these incidents that I think is illustrative, which is, when I think about Representative Crockett, I mean, I know a lot of things about her. I know a lot about her history, but I think about the moment that seems to have, in some ways crystallized in a lot of people's minds when I talk to people and she comes up is Governor Hot Wheels, right? And that generated a lot of attention. A lot of it was positive for her amongst Democrats, and some of it was pretty negative for her amongst other people. The Colbert interview for Tallarico, amongst the people who were the potential universe that he was talking to, was likely to be received almost universally positive.
Yeah.
And if you think about someone who maybe doesn't know much about him at that point, that becomes the thing. He's being censored by Trump, and look at this guy, pretty good interview in a very friendly environment.
Right. I was just going to say it was positive in two important dimensions.
Right.
Right.
And so
both the association is being counterposing him as a combatant of Trump, and that he did. It was a good representation of what he was offering.
Right.
And he handled it well.
And it benefited him. And I think that's what all the polling has showed. And that's fine.
And this on top of we should back on just the inherent difficulty of primary polling. And when we post this on our website, Elliot Morris, UT alum, had a good piece looking systematically at how historically in Texas and in other states, primary polling estimates tend to have bigger, error than a lot more error than general elections. And it's not even as terrible as one might think, but it's clearly demonstrably difficult and not something that you should use as a predictor of the final outcome.
Yeah, that's right.
So with that, Josh, thanks both for being here today. Smart commentary and good prep. And thanks a lot for all the coverage this week. I needed it pretty badly, as it turned out. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin for setting us up so that I could be remote and not infect my colleagues and collaborators. And most of all, of course, thanks to all of you for listening. You'll find supporting data much more at our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And keep an ear out. We'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast soon. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.